Okay, so Jason's been introducing this as do I need a policy for that? Do we need a policy for that? So that's a good question. We'll see what we can answer on that today as we go through here. You know, when you show up, first day of a job, say you've got a new job as an administrator or working in some sort of an administrative function where you're going to be responsible for policies and procedures, and the first thing you're told is, hey, we need a policy for disciplinary action because we're firing someone later today. If that's when we decide we needed to change our policy or update our policy or get one for the first time, the cat's probably out of the bag already. A little late for that. This is something that's really important. We need to look at well in advance of what kind of policies and procedures that we need in place ahead of time. We don't want an immediate need to influence, how we write a specific policy. Better yet, to have a good policy that we follow that guides us through those specific needs on, any day-to-day thing that we may be dealing with. So, as we go through and talk about this today, we want to talk about why do we need policies and procedures and programs, and what are the difference between those three things, the P, P, and P? Are there standards that we need to be considering, or what are best practices that we can be implementing when it comes to our policies, procedures, and programs? And really probably one of the most important things, how do we make sure this is something that is effective, and what is it that we're trying to affect? If we want to measure effectiveness, we obviously need to know what the goal is when we are writing a procedure or a policy. So when we're talking about policy specifically, we're talking about something that is going to guide us towards accomplishing our goals, towards accomplishing whatever our mission is. And so obviously that's why it's important we look at a policy, because we need a framework that gets us from point A to point B, or to keep us with, inside the lines that we need to make sure that we stay in. A policy is something that we need to establish rules, the rules for our organization, the rules that are going to govern how we operate. Policies don't have to be written or even official. As most of us probably know, we have unwritten policies. In fact, I've got this file cabinet right behind me where I keep all my unwritten policies right behind me right here. And we can have policies and procedures because it is the way we function. It's what we operate by. They don't have to be written for us to be operating by them. However, that doesn't really give us a very good framework, and probably doesn't give us a good way to make sure that our organizations are on the same page, all of our individuals are functioning by the same set of rules, and making sure that we obviously are accomplishing our goals and our mission as an organization. We use policies to define a path to reach those goals. We also need to make sure that we are meeting compliance obligations. Often we're dealing with rules or laws that apply to us that place certain requirements on us, and we need to make sure that we're following those rules and those regulations. And so policies will help us do that as well. We can use policies to define rules by which individuals within our organization will function and what's expected. Policies can define expectations. If we're going to, hold people accountable for specific actions and responsibilities, obviously there needs to be expectations, and your policies are going to be the baseline, that we put all those expectations on top of. And so obviously we're going to identify a lot of expectations in our policy for our members, for our employees. We also may use policies to help us prevent or minimize losses or unwanted events. So I should probably change that, not just to losses, but we can have all sorts of different types of unwanted occurrences, whether that's a financial loss, or whether it's a PR problem, or whether, it's problems in how we administrate and run our organization. Those all are going to be losses of a different sort. So how do we prevent and minimize the unwanted occurrences out there? And at the same time, how do we guarantee, or how do we make sure we have something that helps us get to, the opposite, the desired results, which again are those goals and mission that we have as an organization. So a policy is also going to be a framework for our organization's culture. It's not going to actually make the organization's culture, but if we are following the policies that we've adopted, our culture will develop inside of that framework that those policies allow or that they encourage. Or sometimes it could even be a policy that encourages something that we don't want to have happen if it's not the right policy or if it hasn't been written properly. So that policy is going to be a general framework. Sometimes we may think about that as needing to be extremely specific, and sometimes when we see policies, they're very detailed, very in-depth, very lengthy. And that's something that maybe we might want to think about, you know, is that necessary to have extremely detailed and lengthy policies? Maybe that's something that we can put into procedures or programs. And as we go through here, that might be a little more clear for you. When we're writing our policies, I think it's really important before we get started, we need to really understand what is the ultimate goal, what is our purpose, what is our mission. And so it's important to understand that as we're putting this framework together, because this framework of policies is going to be what helps us get towards that mission. So what is our purpose? You know, these policies and procedures are going to direct us towards that goal, towards that purpose, and towards accomplishing our mission. It also helps our employees understand what our mission is as well. As individuals, we have our own missions. Okay, I come to work every day and I expect to, you know, collect a paycheck in 2 weeks, and I expect to, you know, collect a retirement in 20 years. You know, that may be my mission. I hope that most of us have a mission that goes beyond that we have a purpose that we really want to accomplish. But individuals in your organization are going to have their own individual purposes and missions and goals. And so that policy creates that framework that helps our employees understand what is the organization's purpose, what is our mission as an organization, because that will help them in making decisions in executing their duties and responsibilities. It also, you know, various statements support our mission statement. So we may have something that, for example, talks about safety. What is our policy? What is our purpose with regards to safety? What is our purpose with regards to, you know, making sure we have a fair and equal, you know, opportunities for our employees in the workplace? You know, so we may have different statements that are worked into, like an EEOC statement that's worked into our policies, because that is part of what is important to us as an organization, whether it just be from a compliance standpoint or whether that actually that's part of our goals and our mission to actually make sure that employees have a safe, healthy work environment that, you know, where everybody has equal opportunities to succeed. So when do we need a policy? Well, obviously we need a policy if there is a legal requirement. If there is a law that requires a certain action or a certain compliance from us, from our organization or individuals within our organization, then obviously we need to make sure we have a policy that identifies that need to comply. It's also could be something that's just really important to us. You know, if I've got, do I need a policy for that? Well, how important is it to us? And is it something that's just important today but won't be important tomorrow or next week or next year? Or is this something that's really important to us, that's always going to be important to us, that we need to make sure that we're addressing? So that's a question to ask yourself. You know, do I need a policy for this? How important is it to you? And is it a long-term, you know, priority that we need to make sure that we are always addressing? You know, it could be essential functions. We need to identify in our purpose, when we're talking about our mission or our purpose, what are the essential functions that we need to execute in order to accomplish those goals? So again, in our policies, we need to address, you know, what are those essential functions and how do we make sure that those get completed? If it's something that's so important that we can't mess it up because it is the reason we exist, then we need to make sure we have that framework that keeps us in line to make sure we're accomplishing, you know, what we're supposed to do. Could be that lives are on the line. It's something that is so dangerous or hazardous, employee safety, you know, that we need to make sure that we have a program in place to address that. You know, we need to get people to act or not to act. Often policies, when we're talking about rules, they're limiting people's actions and choices in the workplace as much as they are directing people as to what needs to get done and what we need them to do. And so we'll give some specific examples of what kind of policies or statements that need to be worked into your policy, into your policy manual. First off, what is our mission? So when you think about, a mission statement, most organizations should have a mission statement that defines in a very fairly succinct manner what is our purpose, what is it that we want to accomplish. And it needs to do that in a way that helps us direct our actions and our thoughts about how we approach our work so that we're accomplishing this mission. Here's a safety charter, which is like a mission statement for safety. And it talks about, we're committed to safety. We're committed to the safety of our members and our employees. And to do that, there are certain activities that we are going to engage in as part of that commitment to safety. Let's make this a little bit more, let's kind of make it a little bit more simple. When we are writing a mission statement, it needs to be something that your employees can remember. If it's a full-page document, if it's 500 words, your employees aren't going to remember that whole statement. And so it needs to be simple enough that your employees will remember it. They can go over it in their head when they have a question about how they need to act in a certain situation. They will know that mission statement. It can help direct them. It needs to be something that they see. So not only does it be something short enough that they can remember it, but it needs to be someplace visible. Do we post our mission statement in the office somewhere or in the shop somewhere so that our employees are reminded? If we were to ask our employees, what's our mission? They should be able to answer that question. They should be able to tell us what our mission is. In a past life, I worked for Costco Wholesale. I spent almost a decade as a manager at Costco, and I'm a big fan of the company. I love Costco. And, in working there for 8 years didn't change, that making me a fan of the company. In fact, it solidified that because I really think it was a great company. Costco has a mission statement that we always made all of our employees memorize. And we would go up to our employees from time to time and we'd ask them to recite the mission statement, especially when we're doing year-end performance evaluations. Sit that employee down and have them tell us what's our mission, and we'd want them to recite that. This is, Costco's mission statement. They say that they want to continually provide their members with quality goods and services at the lowest possible prices. They say so that's a big part of their purpose right there. I can remember that. And to achieve that mission, they're going to conduct their business according to a code of ethics. And I really love this because I would think about this all the time. I would be asked, I would go to my boss sometimes and I'd say, hey, I've got this dilemma. I'm not sure how to approach this. And he'd say, well, what's our code of ethics? And if I would go back and think about the code of ethics, it would make my decision for me. Obey the law. Well, is it legal? Okay, that's a good one to start with right there. If what I want to do isn't legal or not going to help us be compliant with laws, then that's probably not a good decision. Take care of the members, take care of the customers. What's going to be the best choice to make sure I'm taking care of the customers? That's going to guide me in the decision that I need to make. Also, taking care of the employees was a priority. That was part of this rule of this code of ethics that the company had. And so what's best for the employee? Are we taking advantage of the employee? Are we abusing the employee? Are we really providing, the best working opportunity and environment for that employee so that they in turn want to take care of the company? Respecting the vendors, not taking advantage of the people that we're doing business with. That would help guide us in decisions that we would make. And then ultimately, the goal of any for-profit, corporation, public company is going to be to reward the shareholders. And so if we do all those things, obviously we're successful and we're able to reward our shareholders at that point. So I really like that mission statement because it would help me make decisions. It would help guide me and direct me in my decisions as a manager. How I was going to deal with the customer, how I was going to deal with the employee, how I was going to deal with people we were doing business with. And that reminder was very important to me. So a mission statement is something that's really important to help guide you, not just in writing your policies, but your employees all need to know it so it guides them in their actions on a day-to-day basis. Now, outside of your policy, we have procedures. So procedures are something that come into play to help us carry out the policy. How do I accomplish a policy? If I have a policy that says that we are going to be compliant, with, equal employment laws, then how exactly am I going to do that? The policy statement could be very short, saying, that we will provide a workplace, that is, has equal opportunities for all people, regardless of race, gender, religion, whatever, you want that EEO statement to be. But how do we actually do that? That's where we need to look at a policy. So it helps us carry out that policy in a specific way. It delivers, for example, if our purpose is to deliver safe water to residents of the city, and that's our mission, our purpose. We have our policy that's written to help us make sure that we're delivering safe water to our residents. But how exactly do we do that? Do we put down in our policy and procedure manual every single little thing that we need to do, from, checking valves, 2 times a year, exercising valves, monitoring for leaks and all this other stuff? Does that all need to be in your policy? Well, no, not necessarily. We need to be, we can put that into our procedures. How do we actually accomplish or comply with our policy? So there's step-by-step directions that help us make sure that we are, fulfilling our policy. So, for example, if our policy is to deliver safe drinking water to our residents, then we need to look at the steps as to how are we going to collect that water, sanitize it, store it, make sure that it's safe and how it's delivered, and also making sure that it's going to happen in a way that's cost effective as well. So policies and procedures are 2 different things. Even though often we have this manual that we call the policy and procedures manual, the procedure doesn't necessarily, have to be part of the policy. It is a result of the policy so that we can accomplish that policy. Programs are similar. A program is a specific program that we write to help us make sure that we are dealing with a problem that may exist and how we're going to do that. So it's an organized effort to address that problem. What are we going to do to accomplish our mission? And it's not just rules, but it could be something that is required because of rules. For example, we may have some safety regulations that we have to comply with. And to comply with a certain safety regulation, we may need to have a certain program, such as a hearing conservation program, or a respiratory protection program, or a hazard communication program. All the details of those programs need not be in the policy, but the policy may say that we will, have and maintain a, for example, hazard communication program that is current with the standards required by, OSHA, CFR, and you can cite whatever it is. If that law changes, I don't have to go back and change my policy. I do need to go in and change my procedures or change my program, but the policy still refers to that specific law that I need to be compliant with that law. So just kind of an example how your policy can be, can be more succinct and clear while not requiring that we go back and actually change the policy continually whenever we need to do something a little bit different. Another thing that we have in place to help us accomplish our goals and our mission is, documents. We're going to need documents that we use as we do these various functions that we have, as we are engaged in complying with certain programs that we have. So it could be a permit system. Earlier today, Jason was talking about confined space entry. So we have a permit required confined space. We need to have a document that is used as part of that procedure to make sure that we are following that program, properly. It could be checklists, it could be reports, work orders that we use to make sure that when we've identified a problem, that problem gets repaired and reported back when it is completed. Policy and reality is important to understand. These aren't always going to be the same thing, or our policy and our written procedures may not always be the same as what we actually do. How do we actually do something? Does it match our policy? Does it match our written procedures? If not, we have a problem. If we wind up in a situation where we need to defend ourselves on some action, maybe in a court of law, in a liability situation, and our policy and procedures say that we do things one way, but what we're actually doing is a different way, what is our actual policy and procedure? It's actually what we do. It's not what's written down, but the fact that we have something else written down different than what we do, could demonstrate that perhaps we've got some problems in how we're operating. So it's really important that when we identify these policies and procedures, that they're for a reason, and we need to make sure that we're following them. To follow them, we need to know them. And if your policies and procedures, again, are 10,000 pages long, if it's the Internal Revenue Code, then nobody's going to know it. And if they don't know it, they can't follow it. And so it's really important that policies and procedures be something that are available to all of our employees, and that they are presented in a format in a way that it can be understood and executed by all of our employees, so that we actually follow, what we have identified, as being our procedures that we're going to follow. Your policies, your procedures, your programs, they're all living documents. We could argue whether the Constitution of the United States is a living document, but our policies, procedures, and programs definitely are living documents, meaning they're subject to change. What is the right way to do something this year may not be the right way to do something next year. We may have new processes. We may get different equipment. We may actually have different responsibilities placed on us, so that our scope changes. Laws may change so that our compliance, things that we have to be in compliant with, may change, and that could require changes to our policy as well. So over time, we need to make sure that these policies and procedures, that they are current and that they reflect, what is our current mission and what are the requirements that are placed upon us at any given time. When was the last time you updated your policies and procedures? Was it last year? Was it 10 years ago? Was it 20 years ago? We've seen policies and procedures that, have been around for a long time. And a lot of things in those policies and procedures haven't changed. Maybe even the lion's share, you have a policy that's 20 years old, the lion's share of what's in there may be exactly the same, because our purpose today is probably the same as it was before. But how we accomplish that purpose is going to change over time. And so that needs to be something that we pay attention to. We need to be updating those policies, on a real-time basis as needed. And then, is everything current with our current operations, or with current legal requirements, current law? What does it require from us? Again, if we change a procedure, if we build a new water treatment facility that has new technology and functions in a different way, our policies and our procedures especially may not be current. We need to change to match our operations, to match our equipment, to match, our staffing, and to make sure that we're compliant with laws, with the legal requirements on us. Which brings us to the last question: when was the last time you actually had your attorney look at your policies and procedures and help you confirm that they are that they're compliant with current law, so that we can make sure that we are following the law and any regulations that are imposed on us that we need to be compliant with? And that's a very important step, and that's something that's very specific to your organization. It may be different for a county than a city. It may be different for a city than a special service district, and there's definitely going to be differences in the laws that are required for a solid waste facility versus a water treatment facility, or a fire district, or some other public safety district. So we need to make sure that we have our legal counsel who is familiar with our organization and our purpose and our functions to help us make sure that that policy is current and compliant with the law. So when we have to change the policy, how do we do that? That's a pretty good question. So I go to a trusted legal advisor and I ask the question. I say, every time we change policies and procedures, do we need to have our governing body approve that? Okay, whether it's a city council or county commission or a board of directors, board of trustees, do we need to have this approval, to change the policy? And what do you think the answer is that I got? Jason, you have any ideas the answer to that question?
Oh, I was just typing a response. Sorry, I had a question from Debbie, so tell me again.
So when I go to the legal counsel and I say, do we need to have our changes in policy adopted by our governing body every time we have a change, what do you think the legal counsel told me?
It depends.
It depends, exactly. That's exactly right. It depends. There's no right answer for every single one of us. And so who can make changes to the policy? Well, we can, anybody who is in that responsibility for drafting, can obviously draft changes, but for the change to actually be adopted and become official, who can actually put their stamp of approval on that? Well, it may depend on what kind of organization you are. It's going to be different, definitely, for a special service district than for a city or for a county. And so the type of organization is going to matter. Who has the executive authority in that organization? A special service district is always going to have a director. There's going to be an executive director or a manager who's responsible. That person is that person who has that authority to make those changes. In a city, it could be a little bit different. Do you have a strong mayor, or do you have a strong city manager? That executive authority needs to reside with somebody, or does the executive authority lie, with the council? And so that's something for each that could be different even within cities that we need to make sure we understand. Counties also, is the county commissioners, is that body your executive authority, or do you have for an example, a county administrator who's empowered with, administrative authority? So it's going to, again, depend on your organization who has that authority. Now, there's certain things that we always will need to make sure that, we're being compliant with, or that we're being consistent with. How have we made changes to the policy in the past, regardless of whether it's necessarily required by law to have your governing body adopt the policy? If that's the way you've always done it in the past, you may need to continue doing that until you've done some formal change, or so that governing body adopts some formal change that allows something other than that. Also, we may need to be looking at, will the change carry the force of law? If we are a government entity like a city or a county, where we're actually, our city council or our commissioners can enact ordinances and law, that if that change is something that is going to have an impact or in law, or it carries the force of law along with it, obviously that's going to have to be something that's approved of by that governing body, by that city council, or by those commissioners. But if it's not something that carries the weight of law, then it is possible that then an executive, someone with that administrative authority, may be able to adopt changes to policy. Again, something that you want to make sure that you work out with your legal counsel. Now, procedures and programs, that's different from policy. Your procedures and programs are, again, the specific steps that we follow in order to make sure that we're complying, or that we're following our policy. And often those procedures and programs may need to be changed, in which case definitely the person who has the administrative executive authority in your organization can approve those changes to procedures and to programs that you have in place. But again, make sure if you have any question about, how you can do it versus how you have done it in the past, or what's legal for your organization, make sure you're consulting with your legal counsel to make sure that it's being done properly. When we write a policy, we want to make sure we have a consistent format, and there's lots of ways that you can organize that policy in a way that make it easy to maintain and update, so that you can go in by section and make sure that you are, referring to the same policy that someone's talking to you about, or if we're making a change to a policy, we can address just a specific section of that policy. So pick a format and stick with it. Make sure that it's consistent, from year to year to year, how we format that policy so that changes are congruent. We can go and see what our revisions have gone from A to B to C, and they maintain that same format. We want to make sure that the average reader is going to be able to understand that policy. Sometimes we get a lot of legal speak, in our policies, but if we can't understand, if the average person can't understand exactly what that is being communicated, then the policy doesn't really do us a whole lot of good if we don't understand it. So we need to make sure that it's written, composed in a way that we understand what it means, so that we can follow it. Your policy is going to have multiple elements that you're going to want to work into that. What is your purpose? That mission statement, that's a great way to start out, your policy. What is the scope of the policy, any references, definitions, individual responsibilities. So we may define words, we may define positions. We need to define what are the responsibilities of certain positions, or when we're talking about a policy, what position is responsible for executing that policy, for example. What is your revision history? When we make a change to the policy, we need to make sure that we keep a good record of what the policy was and what it has changed to. So, make sure that you prepare that policy in a way that allows you to maintain that revision history in a manageable way. Something that we can implement to make sure that we are following our policy and working towards our mission or our objective is a management system. Having a management system in place, it provides a framework, for these processes, for these procedures, to make sure that our organization is, following the policy and working towards our ultimate purpose and mission that we have in place. Sometimes you can have specific management systems that your organization can actually become certified as being, compliant with a specific management system like ISO 9000 or ISO 14000, and some organizations will actually follow that. And that, when you do that, it actually puts us, it's like putting a seal of approval on your organization. When we show that we have, an ISO 9000 organization, we know exactly how that entity is being operated. It communicates, the level of detail that organization is following to make sure that its procedures are being followed, to make sure that its purpose and its mission, is being worked towards and achieved. A management system, whether you adopt a formal management system or whether you put into place your own management system, that management system needs to provide consistency to how we operate, to how we get things done. Also, there needs to be accuracy in there so that we can verify, that how we're doing, and if we're doing things right, if we're compliant with laws, if the information that we have in there is up to date. A management system will also define how we identify different aspects of our operation, or how we identify hazards that we may be dealing with. What are the impact of those different operations or hazards that may come into play in those operations? That's going to be really important in helping us identify policies and specifically procedures and programs. Is understanding what are the potential impacts so that we can minimize or avoid unwanted impacts. What are the legal requirements or other requirements that we have that we need to fulfill? Our duties, roles, responsibilities, and authority. We need to make sure that we understand those. And when people fill specific roles, and when someone has a specific authority given to them, that allows us to maintain this consistency and accomplish the objective and the goals. Training is something that should be identified as well. How do we make sure that our organization is trained? How do we make sure our individuals know how to do their job? How do we make sure that everybody is able to do their job safely? Document control, operational control, verifying, that we are following these controls, corrective actions, self-audits are all things that we should work into our management system to help make sure that we are getting to the end goal and making sure that we're following our policies and procedures. On a regular basis, management needs to review, how we're doing, and if we're following our management program, and if we are following our procedures and accomplishing our goals.
Hey, Doug, Debbie's got a question on management systems. She says, does a management system mean we have to develop a metric system to make sure we are meeting the goals?
Well, you would be difficult to have, you need to be able to measure your results if you're going to get to those goals. I mean, they definitely need to be measurable. The old adage, is the SMART goals. Is specific, measurable? Is it achievable? Is it results oriented? Is it time limited? If we can't measure these things, we're not going to be able to know that we're achieving our goals. And so I think absolutely a management system is going to require that we have the ability to measure certain functions and processes as well as progress, in doing that. So again, when we're looking at this management system, understanding what are the aspects and hazards that we're dealing with, what is it that we do, what does it take to get it done? For example, going back to the culinary water system, what does it take to get that water? Our mission is to provide safe drinking water to our residents. So what does that take? We need to have a system we need to have a source. There needs to be pumps. There needs to be storage reservoirs, pipes. There needs to be, maintenance of these things. There has to be meters. There has to be certain pressures that are monitored and controlled. And so, when we get into that, we really need to understand what could go wrong here, what do we need to accomplish our goal, and what can go wrong with that as we go through that, identifying those hazards. If we have a water main break, what can be the result? Well, we could have some flooding, and we see lots of liability claims come in, from flooding, from a broken pipe or something. What can we work into our management system to help minimize those types of breaks? Or how about a cross-contamination or some other contamination of the water supply, where we put people's health at risk? That's definitely, a hazard that we need to consider that needs to be addressed in, this management program that we put into place to make sure that we are accomplishing our policies, that we're, meeting our goals and our mission. There could be legal requirements that we need to make sure we're following. So what regulations apply to me? Jason and I and Brent, we work a whole lot with, safety regulations and helping you be compliant with safety regulations, because that's our biggest priority, is making sure that, you and your employees are safe. And so, we could look at, what safety regulations you need to be compliant with, but there may be other regulations also that your organization needs to be compliant with. Open Meetings Act, rules and things like that you need to make sure that you're compliant with. So you need to make a list of all the regulations that apply to your organization, and so that you can work those into your program to make sure you stay compliant. So it could be, law, it could be, standards that we want to make sure that we're compliant with. There may be an ASTM or an ANSI standard that you want to make sure that you're following. It's not law, but, if we go to defend something, often those types of standards are considered to be the standard that, we follow to determine whether you're being reasonable and prudent and make sure that you're doing your job the way you're supposed to. So what standards, whether they be legal standards or best practices or industry standards, do we need to make sure that we are following? So it'll take some research to make sure that you know what all standards you need to have in place. When it comes to safety standard, OSHA has great resources available on their website to help you identify, different standards that may apply to your organization and exactly what those standards are. And so that's one great resource when it comes to OSHA, for example, where you can go and do a lot of research. You can also, get our help. You can contact us if you have specific questions about those standards or what standards you may need to be aware of and be implementing in your organization. For example, you can go to OSHA and get all sorts of information about the confined space standard, as well as, samples of programs and permits and other things that you need to have as part of your management system, to make sure that we're achieving our goals. So these standards exist, they're out there, they're published, and we can incorporate those into, our policies and really specifically into our procedures and programs. Because if the goal is to be, or if the policy is to be compliant with the safety laws, then obviously the requirements of an OSHA standard are going to be worked step by step into those procedures and programs that we are going to adopt and be following. So again, there's lots of resources there, and we can help you with those as well. Objectives and targets. We need to make sure when we're identifying this mission, like Debbie brought up, is this something that's measurable? Do we have goals? Do we know what the short-term, intermediate, and long-term goals are that we need to accomplish? In developing your management system, that needs to be a part of it. If I just have a long-term goal, but I never look at, what are the short-term goals or the intermediate goals that get me to that long-term goal, I'm never going to get to that long-term goal. So we need to make sure as part of that management program that we're breaking it down between those, day-to-day goals to, monthly, yearly goals to our ultimate, mission and purpose, to make sure that we're achieving those. Part of this is going to be identifying, like we said, what resources are available to your employees, what are individuals' roles, what are those responsibilities, and who has specific authority, so that when we're dealing with a certain problem, we need to know who is the person who's going to make decisions, or that we need to go to, when we are dealing with, something that is problem, or who is the person who is giving direction, so those need to be identified and defined within this program as well. Training is a really important thing that, like we mentioned, that we need to make sure we're doing, so work that into your management program as well. What training do we need, and how are we going to accomplish that training, and how do we document it and make sure, keep track of it and stay on top of it so that our employees get the training that they need to have. So you can have document control is going to be not just a part of making sure that our training is being accomplished, but all of these measurable aspects of our management system needs to have documentation. So we need to be able to create the documents that we need to execute our management system, to follow our procedures and our programs. We need to identify how we're going to retain these documents, where are we going to keep them, which ones need to be available, how long we need to keep them for, how do we keep track of revisions and changes to these documents, and on what kind of a frequency are we going to be looking at these changes and revisions and reviews to make sure that if something needs to be improved, that we're going to take those steps to make sure those improvements are made. Operational controls are going to be a big part of your management program as well, making sure that procedures are being followed. We identify those procedures, but how do we actually make sure that those procedures are happening? Again, there needs to be controls in place and responsibilities given that we can verify and document. So do procedures contain how it's really done? Well, again, if we're doing it something different than how we've identified it in our official procedures, then one of two things: either the procedure isn't ideal and we've identified a better way to do it and we've just started doing it differently, or we're not familiar with what the procedures are, so we're not following them, or someone's not enforcing them. Maybe people are cutting corners and doing it an easier way because it gets the job done faster. So we need to look at that. If we're not really following the procedure, does the procedure need to be changed, or do we need to make sure that we are enforcing the procedure and following that procedure? So a really important part of this, I've alluded to it several times already, is verification, and documenting that verification, making sure that we're following our policy, procedures, our programs. That's going to require some kind of auditing system, on some sort of regular basis. Some things that may be things that you check weekly and document to make sure they're done. It could be things that need to be documented daily that we ensure are being done. It could be something less frequent. We encourage you as part of your TAP program to make sure you have a procedure in place for, doing safety checks and some sort of documented program for going through your facilities and looking at your operations and making sure that things are functioning in a safe manner the way that they're supposed to. So we could have internal audits. And sometimes we need to not just look at, making sure we have that procedure in place for doing that audit, but do we have also a procedure in place, a part of our management program, to verify that the audit's happening too? So we need to audit the audit. Someone, probably the chief executive or the administrator needs to be doing some sort of verification, that these programs are being followed. It could be a third party that you have come in and do audits for you. Some of you may have swimming pools, and this summer you've had this aquatic examiner service that we made available to you, where a third party comes in to look at your operations and help you identify if there's any weaknesses in your policies, in your procedures, in your operations, to identify changes to make sure that we have the best and safest operations out there. How often do these audits need to be happening is something that needs to be worked into your management program as well. What things need to be checked daily, weekly, monthly, or annually. So corrective and preventative action. Obviously, when the audit turns up something that's weak or that's not ideal or that's just outright wrong, then do we have a program in place to identify how do we fix it? How do we correct it? How do we make it better? So, does your management program entail, some sort of action to eliminate the cause of the weakness? Do you document the corrective action? Do you use something that will verify that not only did we identify that there's a problem, but it's actually been completed, and who completed it, and what was done to fix that problem? And so it could be something that could just be, a maintenance issue that needs to be addressed, or it could be something like when we do our near miss, our incident investigations, where we've identified a potential hazard out there, and we look at it and we go, why did this happen? What are the root causes? What are we going to do different going forward to make sure that this hazard doesn't engage us in the future, in an unexpected negative way? And so that corrective and preventative actions need to be a part of that management system that you put into place. And we need to be able to evaluate it, like Debbie mentioned. If we need to have some sort of metric that we're following, so that we can make sure that we can show that it is actually being done, that it's being completed. And that may involve different requirements, whether it's just the self-audits or whether it's that legal review with your attorney looking at your procedures annually, or whatever that the need may be. Your management team should be looking at your management system twice a year to make sure that you're following the management system, so that to make sure that the policies are up to date, that the procedures are up to date, that we are doing our self-checks, our audits, that we are documenting our performance and our accomplishments to make sure that that system is working. It's something that has to be revisited from time to time. And when we do that, obviously we will identify things that need to be better, and that may require us to revisit the policy, or it may just require us to revisit the procedure or the program. It may not require redoing the whole thing, but we do need to be looking for what needs to change in the future so that this either works better or so that we avoid failures that we've had in the past. So what policies and procedures do I need to make sure I have? There's a pretty good list here of things that you want to consider and make sure you have them, either procedures or programs that you need to have in place, or policy that you should consider making sure that you have in place as part of your policy manual. Procedures and programs that we ought to address, obviously EAPs, emergency action plans, fire prevention plans, bloodborne pathogen program is something that all employees to some extent need to be aware of. So we need to think about what our potential exposure is there in having a bloodborne pathogens program, lockout, tagout programs, confined space entry, personal protective equipment. How do we identify what personal protective equipment is needed and ensure that it's provided and it's being used and being cared for properly, and all those things that go along with that. Respiratory protection, if the hazards exist that would require that, we need to make sure we have a respiratory protection program. Hearing conservation program, the same thing. If certain exposures exist at a certain level, then we need to make sure we have a hearing conservation program. Hazard communication is something that program needs to be in anybody's organization where we're using any kind of chemicals. And that could just be cleaning chemicals. So, we should all have a hazard communication program. For some of us, it's going to be a much bigger program than others. Your employee handbook, your policy, you should have specific policies that address things like FMLA, making sure that we're compliant with FMLA, equal employment laws or non-discrimination laws, workers' compensation, return to work policy, for example. Those of you who are TAP recipients are familiar with the return to work policy. And if you're not familiar with it, then give us a call so we can help you, know what you should have in your workers' compensation policy and in your return to work program. A drug-free workplace policy is something that, we're required to have in there, and so that's something, that needs to be a part of it. A driver qualification policy. Again, it's one of those things that we recommend as a best practice. If you're a TAP recipient, you're going to have a driver qualification policy. How do we ensure that we are putting safe drivers behind the wheel? What does that entail? How do we do that? Employee handbook may also cover things, and this again, part of your policy, a code of conduct. What is acceptable and unacceptable behavior? Do we allow horseplay or not? Don't allow any horseplay, okay? Make sure that's part of your policy. What are your disciplinary procedures? This needs to be determined before you have to discipline somebody. Before you have to terminate somebody, what is the procedure we need to follow when terminating somebody? What is the grievance process? You know, if we do discipline somebody or terminate somebody, is there a grievance procedure that we need to follow, like a Loudermill procedure, to make sure that that employee's rights are protected, that they have that appeal process available to them? Compensation and benefits, you know, how does that work? That's something that's pretty important to make sure that you spell out for your employees, you know, how they're compensated, and what benefits they receive, and what do they have to do to receive those benefits. Leaves of absence, you know, if you don't have a leave of absence policy and you have an employee who goes out on a forever leave, you know, how do you resolve that situation if you don't have a leave of absence policy in place? Violence in the workplace, very important thing, kind of scary thing in the world today. I'm trying to think back to our training that violence in the workplace is the number 1 or number 2 cause of location of homicide for women. I think, I can't remember, Jason, maybe you can remind me on that one. I think it's the second leading cause of homicide in women is workplace violence. And so that's obviously something that we need to make sure that we're addressing. You know,
number 1.
It's number 1. I mean, if you're a woman and you're going to be murdered, it's most likely to happen at work. Does that make you feel better? You're glad you tuned into this webinar today now. So professionalism, lots of times, you know, we need to identify for our employees. It's kind of similar to that code of conduct, but what is considered, you know, what is required of you, you know, as a professional, you know, and that could be something that we're going to spell out in our policy as well. Confidentiality requirements. People, especially in certain positions, may have very specific requirements as far as what is confidential, what they keep confidential or not. And it may be things that all employees may be aware of, and there needs to be some level of confidentiality that they are responsible for. And so making sure that you've spelled out for them, you know, what they are, you know, what is expected when it comes to confidentiality is very important. Gifts and gratuities is something, especially as a public entity, as a government entity, we want to make sure our employees understand, you know, when it comes to gifts and gratuities, you know, that can have some pretty negative consequences if we're not, you know, making sure that we follow a proper procedure there. As a general rule, no gifts or gratuities. You know, do you have an attendance policy? Do you have a dress code? You know, we can get into all sorts of problems. Dress codes get so tricky too, because, you know, your dress code, you know, do we say how many inches up from the knee shorts can be? Or, you know, for example, when I was working at, I noticed we're going long. I better not go too much longer on this. But, you know, when I was working for Costco, we had a dress policy that said if you put your arms at your side, that your shorts should be at least as long as your fingertips. Well, some people we discovered had really short arms. And so, you know, be really careful how you draft these things, you know, because people can find all sorts of loopholes in them, or unintended, you know, situations where the policy doesn't accomplish what we want it to accomplish. You know, time records for employees is important. Expenditures, political activities, conflicts of interest, use of equipment and supplies are all things that we need to address with employees by policy, so that they know, you know, what is and what isn't allowed, to make sure that we protect them as well as we make sure we protect us and our organization. You know, all 3 of those are extremely important to make sure that we're protecting. So in summary, you know, do I need a policy for that? Well, it depends. You know, there are certain things you do need to make sure you've addressed in policy. You know, how important is that thing in question to you? Is it a long-term, or is it a short-term, you know, need that we're addressing with it? You know, something we want to consider. But your policies, procedures, and programs, you know, when we ask ourselves that question, do I need a policy for this? Is it something that I actually need to change the policy for, or is it something that we can update our procedures or update a program? Okay, so sometimes we may not need to actually update the policies if we just go in, if the policy refers to the procedure or to, you know, what we're being compliant with, then the procedure can just be updated to make sure that we've got that in place. You know, these are powerful tools, and they can work for us or against us, you know, if they're not done well. So make sure that, you know, you craft these carefully, and make sure you're using your legal counsel. Make sure you have good legal counsel to help you review these things, because, you know, it's not just administrative functioning that's impacted by policies, but we need to make sure that we're compliant with laws and potential liabilities and other exposures. You know, identify the aspects and impacts. What are the hazards? You know, what are the aspects of our operations and what can go wrong with our operations? And think about that in detail as you think about your procedures and your programs to make sure that we're addressing those. And in your management system, make sure that we have ways to verify that those things are being enacted and actually followed and in place, and that we are, you know, making any necessary changes. Take control of your operations, you know, with a management program that will help you make sure that things function the way they should consistently, and that you're accountable too. That when someone questions, you know, how you're doing it or whether you're doing it, that you have that management program in place that gives you those measurable facts that show that you're actually, you know, keeping your program, following your policies. Regularly review and update. Again, at least, you know, semi-annually, at least annually, you need to look at your policies and programs and identify where they need to be updated, where they may need to be changed and improved. And make sure that your policies are your reality. Make sure you have the right policy and a good policy, and then make sure that you're following it, which is going to involve not just making sure that you know the policies and the procedures and the programs, but your employees need to understand those as well. You know, have a mission statement that your employees can memorize, that they know, you know, and then make sure that the policies and procedures are available to them and in a format that they can understand and that they'll remember and be able to follow, you know, and make sure it's not too onerous that it's just impossible for them to remember it or be able to follow it, because we need to make sure that if we adopt a policy, if we adopt procedures and programs, that those are actually what we're doing and what we're following. And that's probably one of the first things you probably need to do if you haven't looked at this for a while, is look at your policies and procedures, read them, and then ask yourself, are we doing this? Are we actually doing this? That's your homework assignment, you know, for today. Make sure that, you know, familiarize yourself with your policies and procedures and ask yourself, you know, are we doing this? And if not, then we need to go into some of these other steps. Implement that management program, making sure that we are actually getting either policies and procedures updated or make sure that we're, you know, following them so that we're doing what we say we're doing. Oh, there's Jason's contact information. So I appreciate you being here. I don't know if there's any other questions we need to address. I know we went a little bit long. Jason?
Yeah, I've got a question here, but it just before we hit that, everybody, if you've got questions, type them into your chat box or into the Q&A box, and we'll get Doug to answer those. Question we have is, does a program implement the procedures?
You know, a program, for example, like a confined space entry program, is going to have procedures as part of it. So yeah, they're very interwoven, where you have a program, especially where it's a program that helps you be compliant with a specific regulation like these safety regulations. Yeah, the procedures are going to be woven into that program.
All right. Good job, Doug. Doesn't look like we've got any more questions or comments. Awesome job. Lots of material there. Important stuff, though, to look at. Final word.
You know, again, you know, make sure that you're familiar with your policies and procedures, and then ask yourself if that's what is actually happening in your organization, you know, and then go from there to identify what needs to be changed to make sure that we're doing things properly. Legal review, make sure that you've got a good legal counsel who's looking periodically, you know, annually at your policy and procedures to help make sure it's up to date, in addition to your management review of your policies and procedures.
All right. Thanks so much, Doug. Good job. Hey, everybody, go out and have a safe day.